Our aim must be the moralization of the individual, of the government, of the people as a whole. We desire the moralization not only of political conditions, but of industrial conditions, so that every force in the community, individual and collective, may be directed towards securing for the average man and average woman a higher and better and fuller life in the things of the body, no less than those of the mind and the soul. With these words, Theodore Roosevelt, ex-President of the United States and candidate for the president under the banner of the Bull Moose Party, opened the 1912 Ohio Constitutional Convention, describing the necessity of reform in Ohio. During the early 1900s, reformers were running rampant with many ideas on how to make Ohio a better place. Women suffragists, prohibitionists, and civil rights advocates were commonplace. This was the Progressive Era. This was the time of robber barons, large corporations, and corrupted politics. This was the time when labor was mistreated, when children worked in factories, and when slums were prevalent. But this was also the time in which Ohio was turned into a center of industry, when interstate trade was flowing, and when cities were flourishing. During the Progressive Era, much of the population began moving to the state's cities, which held the industry and most of the jobs of Ohio. This process of urbanization was occurring all over the country. Between 1880 and 1910, over 11 million citizens had moved from rural areas to cities. Ohio was becoming an industrial center. By the 1900s, it had become one of the most wealthy states in the Union. But with this power and wealth, population increases brought to light many new problems. City services were not able to keep up, and there was significant political corruption. The need for social and political reform escalated during the turn of the century as Ohio gained a spike in population. Within 30 years, Ohio's population had increased by almost 2 million citizens. By 1909, the agitation for social and political reform associated with progressivism had reached such a peak that the General Assembly submitted a referendum on holding a constitutional convention to the voters a year earlier than required.
Those groups that were advocating for change included women who wanted the right to vote in Ohio, African Americans who were looking at more equitable treatment in Ohio, labor groups who were looking for things like minimum wage, and generally urban populations who were looking for a broader sense of democracy. If there were groups opposed to this, the groups tended to be conservative, and they tended to be agrarian.
After their desired tax reforms fell through, the Ohio State Board of Commerce passed out thousands of leaflets formally opposed to the convention. On January 9, 1912, the convention was called to order. Herbert S. Bigelow, a well-known progressive minister from Cincinnati, was named the president of the Constitutional Convention. After initial discussions, the group decided not to create a new constitution. Instead, the delegates drew up and proposed 42 new amendments that ranged from the conservation of natural resources to women's suffrage. These amendments were forged with the hope that they would end or reduce corruption in politics and business. During this time, reform groups pushed for their own ideas to go through. Labor unions cried out for better working conditions such as minimum wage, set work hours, and workers' compensation. Political reform groups such as the Direct Legislation League of Ohio, founded by Bigelow, suggested initiative and referendum in order to protect and sustain the democratic system in Ohio. Municipal home rule was also proposed, which would give cities the ability to control their own police force, sanitation departments, and transportation. The amendments were put on the ballot during the special election on September 3, 1912. Out of the 42 proposed amendments, Ohioans approved 34 and rejected only 8, including women's voting rights. Herbert S. Bigelow, the president of the convention, had this to say: "The greatest commercial asset a state can have is an honest, efficient, and progressive government. Such a government contributes to the morale no less than to the material well-being of a commonwealth. The demand for such a government is the token of a great awakening that has come to the American people. In no state is there greater evidence of this awakening than in the state of Ohio at the present time.
One of the approved amendments allowed the state to create laws requiring companies to offer workers' compensation. This forced corporations to improve their working environments in order to increase the safety factor. More injuries meant more money went out to pay compensation. In addition, several workers' compensation programs were created soon after the amendments were ratified. Many of these companies are still in use today. An example of an insurance company created during 1912 is the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation. They provide insurance to over 1/3 of Ohio's workforce, and they hold the largest exclusive state fund in the nation. Another amendment was passed that dealt with labor. It is more general, giving the state the ability to set a minimum wage, set the work hours limit, and provide for the general welfare of employees.
Thomas S. Farrell, a delegate to the convention, gave his thoughts on the necessity of minimum wage. The appalling state of affairs disclosed by the investigation of the labor conditions in the steel industry of this country seems to me to be sufficiently repulsive to the average man to make him see the necessity of such a provision in our Constitution. The recent revolt of the textile workers of Massachusetts against the wage-slave conditions prevalent in that industry when 25,000 men, women, and children, without a semblance of organization, went out on strike against a reduction in their wages, already so low that their condition was next to starvation, must give all thinking men pause.
On the political stage, one of the most influential amendments passed was the Initiative in Referendum Reform. Initiative allowed the people to place important issues on voting ballots that politicians were not willing to deal with. Similarly, referendum allowed politicians to place controversial issues on the ballot so that the voters would be responsible for the passage, not the politician.
Initiative referendum is something that allows, obviously, for citizens by petition to begin to change legislation, or in some instances to recall an elected official. And the one way you might look at it is a return to pure democracy. That is, it moves away from a Senate and a House of Representatives being the sole powers that could create legislation and put power back in the community's hands.
These two processes have been used time and time again by both citizens and legislators. Between 1913 and 1998, Ohioans have voted on 65 proposals placed on the ballot through initiative. Through this process, legislation such as the Term Limits Amendment in 1992 was put through.
In 2010, citizens of Ohio recalled Senate Bill 5, set forth by Ohio Governor John Kasich, which would remove collective bargaining rights for labor unions. After many protests and a wide outcry, over 1.6 million signatures were collected to remove this law from the ballot, made possible by referendum.
Another major amendment passed was Municipal Home Rule, proposed by Cleveland Mayor Newton D. Baker. This allowed cities to control their own police force, sanitation departments, and basically govern themselves as long as they followed state laws. This would help to establish more efficient and less corrupt city officials, as well as increase the democratic process at a local level. Cleveland was one of the first Ohio cities to draw up its own city charter. Previously, cities could not deal with population growth because they had no general grant of powers. Now, urban areas with over 5,000 citizens like Cleveland could gain control of their business and were now able to solve their individual problems. In his explanation of the 1912 Ohio Constitution, Herbert Bigelow describes the Home Rule Amendment. Municipal Home Rule is second only to the initiative and referendum in importance. Its adoption will bring a great, peaceful, and beneficent revolution. It will set the cities of Ohio free. Under it, the people of any municipality may elect charter commissioners, frame and adopt their own form of government, and thereafter change it as they deem proper.
Through the Ohio Constitutional Convention of 1912, a new chapter was written in the name of progressivism, as these amendments turned the page in the book of Ohio's history.
Through the Ohio Constitutional Convention of 1912, a new chapter was written in the name of progressivism, as these amendments turned the page in the book of Ohio's history.
During the early 1900s, Ohio's political stage was teeming with progressives who sought to cure the troubles brought upon the country by the rapid industrialization and urbanization of cities. With over 30 amendments passed at the convention, the balance of power was shifted from large corporations to the labor unions through the creation of companies such as the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation. Legislators created municipal home rule, giving cities the general grant of powers. The state also took a step towards democracy through initiative and referendum. A new chapter was written in the name of progressivism as these amendments turned the page in the book of Ohio's history.